The envelope was taped to my front door at 6:13 in the morning. Not slipped into the mailbox, not emailed, not mailed certified like normal HOA notices. Taped, right at eye level, white paper, red stamp, my name in block letters. And before I even opened it, I already knew Diane Holloway was behind it. Because only one person in Oak Ridge Estates enjoyed making paperwork feel like a threat. I pulled the envelope free, stepped back into the house, and opened it at the kitchen counter while the coffee was still brewing. At the top, in bold, notice of emergency enforcement action. Below that, fine assessed $5,000. I read the number twice. Then I read the reason. Unauthorized hazardous visual barrier, repeated non-compliance, hostile modification affecting community safety and value. For a second, I just stood there in total silence. Then I laughed. Not because it was funny, because it was so insane it felt fake. A $5,000 fine. For a privacy wall in my own backyard. That's what the letter claimed anyway. But I knew the truth the moment I saw Diane's wording. This wasn't about safety, it wasn't about rules, and it definitely wasn't about community value. It was revenge. Because 3 days earlier, I had told Diane Holloway no in front of 2 board members, a landscaping contractor, and half the neighborhood walking trail. And women like Diane didn't hear no, they collected it. Then they came back with paperwork. What she didn't know that morning, what she had failed to understand before she taped that envelope to my front door like some kind of suburban execution notice, was that I had already started recording everything. The letters, the trespassing, the threats, the fake inspections, the board conversations she thought nobody could hear. She believed that a big enough fine would scare me into compliance. What she actually did was hand me the evidence I needed to tear apart her authority in court. But at 6:13 that morning, standing barefoot on cold tile with a fresh cup of coffee going bitter in my hand, all I knew was this. Diane Holloway had just declared war over a backyard wall, and by the end of it, one of us was going to regret getting lawyers involved. It wasn't going to be me. My name is Owen Mercer, and I moved to Oak Ridge Estates outside Nashville, Tennessee, 2 years after my wife died. That detail matters, because grief changes what you want from a home. You stop thinking about upgrades and resale value and start caring about whether a place feels still enough to survive inside. I bought the house because of the backyard, not because it was huge, it wasn't, but it was private. Backed by a tree line, no rear neighbor, and just enough distance from the walking trail beyond the drainage easement to make evenings feel quiet. I could sit outside after work, listen to cicadas, and for an hour or two pretend the world wasn't constantly trying to drag me forward before I was ready. That yard kept me sane. Then Diane Holloway decided it offended her. She lived 2 houses down and served as HOA president with the kind of joy some people reserve for winning the lottery or ruining Thanksgiving. She was in her late 50s, always dressed like she was about to sell someone a lawsuit, and carried a clipboard so often I started thinking it might actually be part of her skeleton. The first time she came over, she smiled at me from the patio edge and said, "You have such a lovely lot. It would feel much more open without all this separation." She was looking at the cedar privacy screen I'd built along the west side of the yard. 6 feet high, clean horizontal slats, fully inside my property line. HOA approved in writing 6 months earlier. I said, "I like the separation." Her smile tightened just a little. "Of course, but community spaces feel best when they breathe." That was Diane's thing. She talked about the neighborhood like it was a living thing she alone kept alive. A month later, she started sending letters. First, the stain color on the screen was allegedly darker than community harmony standards preferred. Then it was the potted plants near the patio, which she claimed created excessive visual density. Then came the funniest one, a concern that my backyard arrangement discouraged neighbor interaction. That was absolutely true. It was also the entire point. I ignored the first few, then I stopped ignoring them and started saving them. Every notice, every email, every text. Every time Diane passed my yard and slowed down just enough to remind me she was watching. Because the more she pushed, the clearer it became that she didn't want compliance. She wanted access. She wanted sightlines through my yard from the walking trail. She wanted openness for the homes behind the easement. And most of all, she wanted to be obeyed. The real fight started with the lattice extension. I added it in early spring. Nothing dramatic, just 2 extra feet above part of the existing screen using approved wood trim to block the view from the raised trail section behind the drainage berm. People walking there could look directly down into my patio seating area, and after months of feeling watched every time I sat outside, I'd had enough. The extension stayed inside city code. It stayed inside my line, and according to the approval packet from the previous architectural review, it stayed within allowable rear yard screening modifications. Diane hated it immediately. 2 mornings after it went up, she appeared at my side gate with Alan Pierce from the board and a landscaping vendor I'd never seen before. She didn't knock. She just stood outside the gate and called my name like she was summoning a child into the principal's office. When I came out, she pointed at the lattice and said, "What is that?" "A privacy extension." It was not discussed. It was approved under the screening addendum. Alan shifted awkwardly. He clearly knew I was right, which made Diane even more dangerous. She stepped closer to the gate and lowered her voice. "This is hostile architecture." I laughed once because I couldn't help it. Hostile architecture? It sends an aggressive message to the community. No, Diane, it sends an aggressive message to people trying to look into my yard. Alan looked at the ground. The vendor pretended to be deeply interested in a shrub. Diane's face changed. That was the moment I made her angry in public. "You are creating a compliance issue," she said. "No," I answered. "I'm creating privacy." She stared at me for one long second. Then she said, "That can be expensive." 3 days later, the $5,000 fine was taped to my front door. I called the HOA management office at 7:02 a.m. The woman who answered sounded tired before I even gave my name. "There must be some mistake," I said. "I have a $5,000 emergency enforcement fine here." There was a pause while she looked it up. Then a longer pause. "That appears to have been issued under discretionary board authority." "For what rule?" Another pause. "I'm not seeing a direct rule citation attached." That was the moment my anger cooled down into something much more useful. Clarity. "No rule citation?" I asked. "Not on this copy, no." "Who authorized it?" "I can't discuss board deliberations." Of course she couldn't. But I didn't need her to. I already knew the answer. Diane. I called my attorney next. Her name was Rachel Sloan, and she handled property disputes, HOA abuse cases, and what she once described to me as small people with paperwork and too much free time. I emailed her the notice, the earlier letters, my approvals, and the screen modification file. She called back in 11 minutes. "This isn't a fine," she said. "It says fine." "No," she replied. "It's an intimidation attempt shaped like a fine." That sentence made my whole week better. Can she do this? She can try, that's the fun part. Rachel told me to gather everything: approval packets, architectural emails, copies of prior notices, and any evidence of selective enforcement or harassment. I said, "I've got plenty." She asked, "Have you been recording Diane?" I looked at the folder already sitting on my desktop labeled Diane HOA. "Yes." "Excellent," she said. "Then let's ruin her month." What Diane didn't know was that I had installed backyard cameras after the second bogus notice. Nothing dramatic. Just enough coverage to watch the patio, side gate, rear fence line, and the section facing the trail berm. Those cameras had caught a lot. Diane standing outside my fence with a clipboard, gesturing toward the patio while speaking to Alan. Diane peering through the slats of the old screen from the easement trail. Diane walking with 2 other residents and saying, "He's turning the yard into a fortress." And best of all, one clip from the week before the fine. Diane, Alan, and a woman from the architectural committee standing near the trail, while Diane said very clearly, If he won't remove it voluntarily, we'll price him into reason. I watched that clip 3 times before sending it to Rachel. Her reply was one line. That's our headline exhibit. The more we reviewed, the worse it got for Diane. She had emailed residents claiming my yard structure was unapproved. False. She had told the board it created documented safety concerns. Also false. And she had bypassed normal notice procedure by labeling the matter an emergency without citing any actual emergency condition. Rachel drafted a response the same day. Demand to rescind the fine. Demand to preserve all records. Demand to cease harassment and selective enforcement. And one more thing, a warning that if the fine remained active, we would seek relief in court for abuse of authority, improper assessment, and interference with lawful property use. The board had 48 hours to respond. Diane answered in 20, not the board. Diane herself, from her personal email. That mistake alone should have disqualified her from holding office. Her message was 2 paragraphs of polished nonsense about neighborhood harmony, visual aggression, and fiduciary duty. Then, near the end, the sentence that killed her case. The board must retain tools strong enough to compel reluctant owners into cooperation. Rachel called me immediately after reading it. She used the word compel. Bad? Beautiful, Rachel said. The hearing was scheduled 3 weeks later because Diane refused to withdraw the fine, and the board, either out of fear or stupidity, let her keep pushing. During those 3 weeks, Oak Ridge turned weird. Neighbors who had never spoken to me suddenly slowed down while passing the house. 2 residents emailed quietly to say they thought Diane had gone too far. 1 board member resigned for personal reasons. And a contractor who did occasional work for the HOA forwarded Rachel a message chain where Diane described my yard as an example that needs correcting before others follow. That line bothered me more than the fine, because it meant this was never just about me. People like Diane don't punish individuals. They make examples. That's how control spreads. The night before the hearing, I sat in my backyard under the patio light and looked at the lattice extension she hated so much. It was simple, neat, nothing dramatic, just wood and privacy and a little peace. I remember thinking how strange it was that one woman could look at another person's attempt to feel safe at home and interpret it as rebellion. The hearing took place in County Civil Court on a gray Thursday morning. Diane arrived in cream-colored slacks and her best boardroom expression, carrying a thick binder like it contained scripture. Rachel arrived with 2 folders and a tablet. That was enough. The judge started with the obvious question. On what specific covenant authority was this $5,000 emergency fine issued? Diane's attorney stood and began some long explanation about board discretion, visual nonconformity, escalating owner defiance, and neighborhood impact. The judge stopped him halfway through. I asked for covenant authority. There was a silence I will treasure for the rest of my life. Then came the exhibits, my written approvals, the modification addendum, the prior notice history, the management office acknowledgement that no rule citation had been attached, and finally, the camera clips. Diane at the fence, Diane at the trail. Diane saying, if he won't remove it voluntarily, we'll price him into reason. Then her email, compel reluctant owners into cooperation. You could feel the room change, not dramatically. Just that slow shift when everyone present realizes one person has made a terrible mistake and the paperwork is no longer helping. The judge looked directly at Diane and asked, were you attempting to use association fines to force a lawful owner to remove an approved improvement? Her attorney tried to answer. The judge stopped him. I asked her. Diane swallowed, and for the first time since this began, she looked like what she really was. Not powerful, not righteous, just cornered. Her answer was a mess of half-finished phrases about preserving standards, community values, and preventing precedent. That word stood out. Precedent. Rachel picked it up immediately. So this was about discouraging other owners from asserting similar privacy rights? Diane didn't answer. She didn't need to. The silence answered for her. The judge rescinded the fine on the spot. Then came the part Diane never saw coming. The court found the assessment improper, unsupported, and coercive in nature. The HOA was ordered to remove it from my account, pay my legal fees, and cease retaliatory enforcement regarding the approved yard modifications. But the part that really ended her came last. The judge directed that the board review its enforcement procedures in light of apparent abuse of discretionary authority. That's courtroom language for, "You let the wrong person run this place." Diane resigned as HOA president 11 days later. Officially, she cited health reasons. Unofficially, Oak Ridge had realized her personal vendettas were becoming expensive. After that, the letters stopped. The slowdowns by the fence stopped, the weird inspections stopped, and one evening, about a month later, I sat in my backyard with a glass of iced tea and realized something I hadn't felt there in a long time. Peace. Real peace. Not the fragile kind you borrow, the kind you keep. Sometimes people think stories like this are about revenge. They're not. Not really. They're about lines. The invisible ones people assume they can cross if they have enough confidence, enough status, enough stamped paper. Diane thought a $5,000 fine would scare me. Instead, it exposed her. She tried to use fear to get control. What she got was a judge, a transcript, and a very expensive lesson in boundaries. How did you like the story? Subscribe to my YouTube channel.